John chapter 21. And so we pick up reading in verse 1 today, and it says, "After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, 'I am going fishing.' And they said to him, 'We will go with you.' And they went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing." So this morning, as we come into John 21, we begin to realize that we are finding ourselves among the different appearances when Jesus is appearing to the disciples. This is the third time we're going to see that Jesus has appeared to the disciples post-resurrection. So we come into John 21, and we come again into a transitional point in the lives of the disciples. We learn from the gospel accounts in Matthew chapter 28, verse 16, that Jesus has sent the disciples to Galilee, where he is going to meet them again. And it is here that the Great Commission is given on the mountain in Galilee in Matthew chapter 28. But as we open up this last chapter of John, the author gives us a rather intimate account of what is going on, what the disciples are up to as they have been sent ahead to Galilee, as they are waiting on Jesus to arrive. And so as they wait, Peter turns and he addresses some of the disciples who are gathered there with them, and he says to them that he's going to go fishing, right? He is going to go out in a boat, and so here in this moment we already see an element of what today we call groupthink, or perhaps in the reality of the disciples that we have identified Peter as their leader, and they do not really want to be left alone on the shore while he is out busying himself out on the boat. They all want to be together, and if you and I were in that situation in that moment, we could probably relate a little bit, because think about this, right? Think about this in an extremely practical moment. They've had quite the traumatic week. You know what I'm saying? They've had quite the traumatic week. They have been with their hero. They have dined with him, seen Lazarus raised from the dead, had a celebration. They have seen Jesus arrested in the darkness of night. They have seen him put on trial, beaten, murdered, and then resurrected. And not only that, they saw Jesus come walking through walls. So can you imagine the emotions and the psyche of the disciples at the moment? They're probably a little bit on edge. You know what I'm saying? Kind of like you when you get pulled over by the cop and all of a sudden you go crazy. You know what I'm saying? You're like this when the cop comes walking up to the window, except this is times a million more. You know what I'm saying? Because they've seen Lazarus raised from the dead. They have seen their hero arrested, beaten, and murdered. And now he's raised from the dead and he comes walking through the walls. And so emotionally, they're a little bit spent. And so when Peter, their leader, says, "Hey, I'm going fishing," they're like, "I'm in." Because they're like, "Yeah, you're not leaving me here in the dark. I don't know what's going to happen here in the dark. If Jesus starts walking up, I might just lose it." You know what I'm saying? And so they're like, "We're all going on the boat." Even though they're not all fishermen in the moment, they're like, we're all in this together. We're all going on the boat. But notice the important fact that John gives us here. Remember, John doesn't waste words here. Jesus doesn't waste words, but also John, in his retelling of the account of the Gospels, doesn't waste words. He points out to the fact, now if you're a fisherman, you know you would never come back home and tell your friends or your wife that you went out fishing and you didn't catch anything. You'd be like, "Oh, I caught a lot, but I threw it all back because it was smaller. It was too big and I didn't want to clean it." But notice what John does here. And you laugh because you know it's true. You're like, "They was just too busy. I was just too tired. I didn't want to bring it all in. I just decided it was better to throw it back and not have the house smelling like fish." You know what I'm saying? But here what John gives us, he says, they catch nothing. So he's being brutally honest, which is a good thing because we're talking about Jesus in the gospel and honesty here. And so even though we know, based on the arrival of Jesus at daybreak in verse 4, that they are going fishing at the perfect moment in the Sea of Galilee, which is late at night in the early morning hours, and so everything should be primed for them to have a great catch. This was the perfect time to go fishing, to fish through the night when everything should have been just right. But John gives us the facts here, that they catch nothing. And all of their work and all of their efforts, the nets come back completely empty. So we pick up in verse 4. And it says, "Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, 'Children, do you have any fish?' And they answered him, 'No.' And he said to them, 'Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. And so they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because the quantity of the fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved therefore said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but 100 yards off. So again, let's stop for a moment and let's catch the picture of what's going on here. So they have been off all night long at the perfect time of day to go fishing and have caught nothing. And here in verse 4, John points out that Jesus is standing on the shore watching them, and he calls out to them, and he says, children, do you have any fish? Now, to the random bystander yelling out to a group of full-grown men, 7 of them, 100 yards out in the water, who have been trying to catch fish all night long, this might have been a bit annoying. You know what I'm saying? Men, do you know what I'm saying? All of a sudden, you've been working all night long, working hard all night long, trying to catch fish, and there's a random bystander who's been watching you 100 yards away and says, children, do you have any fish? It could have been annoying. I don't know. Maybe y'all have less pride than I do, but here in this moment, we begin to see that, again, Jesus is providing for us a teaching moment, and in this moment, he instructs them to throw their nets on the right side of the boat. Now, this could even be translated as in actually throw your nets on the correct side of the boat. Now, a little bit more insulting here, not even just the right side of the boat, but the correct side of the boat, if we look at some different translations here. And this, again, for all of you fishermen, or for any type of sports fan in the room, this is like the ultimate armchair quarterback scenario going on here. They have been out at this all night long. They have been doing this, and he may have been standing on the shore watching, because this is Jesus. So how does he get to Galilee? Well, he shows up. How does he get into the room? He walks through the walls. It's not like he has to walk there. I mean, he just appears. So he could have been staying there all night long. And here in this moment, Jesus yells out, just cast the nets on the correct side, or even the right side, whichever reason. It doesn't matter how we translate this. And he says, throw it on the right side of the boat. And it is in this moment that the nets begin to fill to the point where they're not even able to bring them into the boat. And so what is the point of all this? Why in the epilogue of John do we need this story? Why is it here that John chooses to include these words for us to learn? And so what is the point of this long night in this poor fishing story? And so friends, it is here in this moment that we find and we see the boldness, or at least the leadership of Peter, return to the pre-trial of Jesus state. Because remember back in John chapter 13, when Peter was attempting to refuse Jesus from washing his feet, what does he say? No. That's what he says. You thought I was going to go into a long explanation. He says, no. And then he says, if you're going to wash my feet, wash my whole body. He tries to refuse it there. And then Jesus says what? He says, one that is clean doesn't need to have his whole body washed. And then later in John 13, when Jesus is foretelling his own death, what does Peter again say? He says in John 13, and I'm just going to read this for you, beginning in verse 37, he says, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. And Jesus answered to him, will you? Will you lay down your life for me? I mean, read it with the emphasis in the right place. John 13, verse 38, Jesus answered to him after Peter says, I will lay down my life for you. Jesus says, will you? And then he says, truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. So this is the same Peter who was bold enough in John 13 to say, you're not going to wash my feet, but if you're going to wash my feet, wash my whole body. And the same Peter who said, when Jesus is foretelling of his own death, he's saying, well, I'm going to go with you, and I'm going to follow you, and I'm going to lay down my life for me. And Jesus says, no, you're not. You're not going to lay down your life for me, but you're going to deny me 3 different times before the cock crows, before the sun comes up. But we see this denying, this hiding, the cowardice of Peter as a servant girl. A servant girl asked Peter, you're one of the followers of Jesus. And he goes, no. 3 different times in John chapter 18. But now it appears as if Peter has been emboldened again since the resurrection, as he has led the disciples on this fishing journey. Because what does he say? He says, I'm going fishing. They said, we're all in. And they weren't even fishermen, not all of them. It says, we're all in. And so they're like, okay, we're going. We're part of this. But friends, for you and I, this is important. For all of us in the church, for all of us on our walk with Jesus, this is important for us to step back and notice what Jesus is teaching us and how it relates to us in the church, how it relates to us in our personal lives, how it relates to us in our homes. For this is a major point that we're going to attempt to develop this morning. It doesn't matter what we say we believe. Follow with me. It doesn't matter what we say we believe. It does not matter the depth of our knowledge, what our actual knowledge is. What truly matters is our relationship and our trust in the Father. Okay, so it doesn't matter what we say we believe. It doesn't matter what our actual knowledge is about the subject. What actually matters is our relationship and our trust in the Father. And so that's the point that we're going to attempt to develop as we go throughout the next 20 minutes or so. So for here, what we see here already in chapter 21, here's a great leader, albeit a leader with many flaws. Trust me, if Peter showed up in Bookcliff this morning and said he was an ordained pastor, we'd go back and say, well, here's your resume. You probably shouldn't be ordained. You know what I'm saying? You've lied. You've led people on bad trips so far. You're probably not who we want leading in the moment. You know what I'm saying? He probably wouldn't stand up to the standard that we would have, albeit he's a really good leader. And he's going to do some incredible things in Acts we studied a year or so ago. But up until this point, a great leader with many flaws, but a leader nonetheless, a leader who attracts followers. But in this moment, as they go fishing at the perfect time and the right conditions, we need to remember that the perfect time, the right conditions, a great leader with presumably the right gear. What do they have? A boat and nets. Okay, so they're probably trolling and they're trying to throw their nets out and bring the fish in. And even they have good people on board. You know what I'm saying? Good leader, right conditions, right equipment with good people on board, but they don't catch any fish. Now here's where we form a committee and ask why. Right? We get the committee on committees to have the nominating committee to form a committee on why they aren't catching fish. And all the Baptists in the room say amen. Because this is what we do. And here's the reason, or here's my thesis statement on why. It's because they are doing it of their own will and their own volition. Right? It's their own plan. It's something they decided to do. Let's look at the picture. Peter says, I'm going fishing. And they go with him. Is there any evil or malice involved in this? No. What's wrong with going fishing? You're going to hurt the fish? Well, that's debatable for PETA, but no. We probably shouldn't post this sermon online either. Sin? Is there any sin involved in this? Not that we can judge from our limited knowledge of what John is giving us here, but what we do know is that this is about a man going in his own power and will to suit his own desire in this moment. And the same can be said in our church. We can have the greatest boat or buildings. We can have the greatest leaders. We can have all the funds we could possibly need. We can have the right equipment. But when we just go out because we decide it's time to go fishing, perhaps for self-gratification, to build a program, to see our numbers increase, or for any other reason, then we might as well just go play some random kind of sport because it seems like the fun thing to do. Because then in that moment, we are treating church like any other recreational sport. And we may be saying, or you may be saying, Pastor, you are way over spiritualizing a fishing trip. But stick with me for a moment. When Jesus called the disciples, the command was and is in Matthew chapter 4, verse 18, he says this. He said, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, notice the Sea of Galilee, the exact same sea they're at right now, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And immediately they left their nets and followed him. The very same sea, the very same place, and the command is, I am going to make you fishers of men. Follow me. Remember the two words, follow me. Those are vastly important for us this morning and vastly important for the future, but stick with that for this morning. Follow me. So friends, the command for us, if we are followers of Jesus, if we have been called to follow him, and we have been called to be The command is to be fishers of men. So friends, what we see here and what Jesus is teaching and doing here is he sent them to Galilee to give them the Great Commission. That is what he is preparing them to receive. They go fishing while they are waiting on him. And here we get this amazing teaching moment. This Great Commission from the perspective of John. This is the Great Commission, right? So Matthew, we get the Great Commission in Matthew. We get the commission in Acts from Luke. And here in John, this is the Great Commission that he gives us here. This is his perspective of the Great Commission for being sent out. For here as we go, we are to be and we are to go fishing, not just because we are great people, not because we like to be fishing, but because we are fishermen, because Jesus has made us to be fishers of men. And get this, it's not because we are good people. Right? We don't go be fishers of men because we are great people or because we are good people or because we have great strategies or because we have a great legacy or because we are hearing or because we have been told to, but we recognize the one who calls us his children, and we are following the direction of one who has brought us from death to light. And it's not just about a project, friends. This isn't the project of the month. This isn't the strategy of the month. But it's about being his children and knowing that he is directing our paths for his purposes. So why do we go fishing? Because he has called us to be about being fishermen. And what is it about being fishermen that we have been called to do? Being fishers of men. Making disciples, speaking the gospel, teaching the word, going to all peoples. And this is what we are about because he calls them children. Why? Because we are the children of the King and we are about fulfilling his purposes. Now, listen to this verse real quick. A verse that most of us have heard at some point in our lives. Even if we're skeptics in this room, even if we're not believers, most of us have heard this verse at some point or read it on a bumper sticker somewhere. If people are bold enough to put this on their bumper. It says, Jeremiah 29, it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then," listen to verse 12, "then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you." Hear this. He says, "I will hear you. You will seek me and find me. When you seek me with all your heart, I will be found by you, declares the Lord. And I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord. And I will bring you back to the place from which I have sent you into exile." Hear this, friends. Hear what God is telling Jeremiah. When we call upon him and pray to him, he will hear us. When we seek him, we will find him. He will gather us from all the nations. All the nations, that is our brothers and sisters. All the nations, this is why we are concerned about what's happening in the world. All of us are his children whom he is delivering. This promise from Jeremiah is still true today. It's still true today. What we see in John 21 is pointing us forward to the kingdom of the nets being full of his children. Do we catch what Jesus is teaching us through John? It's about the nets being full of his children, beyond what we can fathom and understand when we listen, when we hear, when we are not about our own devices, when we are not about being macho leaders, or about having massive projects, or about building our own boats, or about having our own programs, but we're about fulfilling the plan and about hearing and calling out and about understanding that he is bringing his children home, that he is about filling the nets. He is about the business of the kingdom. That's what it's about when we are about being humble servants of the King, not about seeing how great of a leader we can be or how big of a church we can be or how big or how great or how wonderful our names can be, but when we can be about being humble servants of the King, and we can be about seeking the kingdom. So in verse 9, when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it. Underline that. That's fun. Fish laid on it. Now you're laughing, but I'm going to come back to that. And bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish." See, notice, that's important. "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took bread and gave it to them. And so with the fish, this was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So notice this fact here. So after John tells Peter that it's Jesus, Peter gets dressed. I don't know if y'all find this as humorous as I do. Peter gets dressed, jumps in the water, dressed, and swims to shore about 100 yards to meet Jesus, leaving the others, now this is great leadership here, leaving the others how to figure out how to get the boat to shore. Now this is the fisherman. Jumps in the water, swims, leaving the others how to figure out how to get the nets and the boat back to shore by themselves. Leadership 101, probably not the best plan. You took them fishing, you're supposed to get them back from fishing. So leadership failure here. But when they do make it back across those 100 yards or so, Jesus already has a fire with fish cooking. So here in the moment, Jesus has breakfast for the men who have been out all night fishing and have caught all of their fish in just the few minutes that they have followed his direction. Now they show up to breakfast that Jesus already has for them. So, in my Mississippi mindset, I think, well, how did Jesus make breakfast? Well, you think about this for a moment. Jesus made the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, the planets, and he spoke it. So Jesus said, breakfast. And there was breakfast. You know what I'm saying? Maybe that's not correct. But you think about it. They were still out there with fish. They hadn't come back yet. But there was breakfast already there. And then he asked them for the fish. Now, maybe I'm losing this in translation. That's completely possible. But it's already there. So he speaks and there's breakfast. And then he brings them into breakfast to feed them. He's caring for them. He's demonstrating care and love. All of this from John 13 forward has been about how he's showing love to his disciples. And again, here he's showing love. But this is not the only teaching point that Jesus makes here. Notice that for some reason it is important. It is important that we know that they caught 153 fish. And the nets did not break. Now, there's no supernatural, spiritual reason why they caught 153 fish. I looked. There's just not. Now, you can go look this week if you want, but there's not. But the point is that they were stretched beyond capacity, and it took an incredible amount of work. It took them doing more than they were used to, but they did not break. Friends, catch this point that John and Jesus provide for us in this moment. Friends, when we are about the work of the church, when we are about the work of making disciples, corporately or personally, of loving others, it's not going to be easy. It's going to take an immense amount of labor. But notice they pull them in. Even though Peter jumped out and swam ashore, he left them. Being fishers of men, being disciples means that our nets are going to be stretched. Living the lives of following Jesus cannot be done on the couch or in our comfy chair during business hours or as a hobby. It's going to stretch the way we do life. It is going to stretch the way we do life and the way we process things. For if we have a new identity, we have a new purpose. And we get a new identity when Jesus brings us from death into life. We have a new way of living, one that is about being children, not about being kings. This is massively important for us. When we are brought from death into life, we are brought into being children of the King. It's not about us being kings. Okay? That is massively important for us to grasp, because if it is about us living our lives as kings of our own domain, we're missing what it means to be about the kingdom of heaven, because in the kingdom of heaven, we're not the king. We're not the queen of our own domain. We are rather princesses and princesses of the kingdom, serving the King of Kings. And you think about this, well, if I'm a prince or princess, eventually I'm going to be the king. No, you're not. It doesn't work that way. We always serve humbly at the will of the King of Kings. And that brings us the great amount of joy. And what about that joy? In John 15, it can never be taken away or supplanted by anything or anyone else. That's good. So it's not like it makes us less happy or less joyful or makes us less than anybody else on the planet, but it gives us the great amount of everything that we can possibly understand or imagine. And so we are excited about being children. When Jesus calls us children, when he calls out to the disciples in the boat, he says children, it's not meant to be demeaning, but it's to remind us of our place, of saying we're children. And as children, we have somebody who's taking care of us, somebody who's responsible for us. We talked about this in John 14 when Jesus says, I've gone to prepare a home for you. What is it about home that makes us excited? We're going to some place where we're not it. But he is. And we're not the one paying the bills. He paid it. All the adults should have said amen to that. I don't know if you enjoy paying your mortgage. I mean, come on now. Jeez. We'll talk again on tax season. But he's it, and he's taken care of us, and he's provided for us, and this is what it's about. When we come back to Moses, as he's speaking to the people of Israel, when they're preparing to go into the promised land in Deuteronomy, and he's passing the baton, figuratively, passing the baton from Moses to Joshua, and he's giving them the farewell speech as they prepare to go into the promised land. Again, a verse that we use a lot, but we use it mostly out of context. In Deuteronomy 31, verse 6, Moses speaks to Joshua and he says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, those who are in the promised land. For it is the Lord, your God, who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you." Friends, you and I are likewise the people of God on a journey home. On a journey to the promised land. We have the promises of God, which Jesus is our great high priest, and the Spirit of God not just dwelling over us, guiding us, but dwelling in us. Dwelling in us. And so let us be stretched. Let us understand that as God brings in the catch, it's going to stretch us in immense ways that is going to make us very uncomfortable. It's going to make us work harder than we're comfortable doing. It's going to take us getting out of that comfy chair and out of those situations where we're like, well, this is what I do on Sunday afternoons. This is where I go to lunch. And this is how I do Mondays. And this is how I do Tuesdays. And this is what I watch. And this is how I do things. And this is what my family routine is. And what Jesus is saying, even to the disciples, as they remember, they came from Galilee. Jesus sends them back to Galilee to get the Great Commission. So as they're waiting, and again, this is why we say we're not going to say that they're in sin as they go fishing, but as they're waiting for Jesus to come and eventually give them the Great Commission, they're sitting there saying, well, and Peter's like, well, I might as well do something productive while I'm sitting here. And so his comfy chair in Galilee is fishing. Right? That's what he likes. That's it for him. That's his couch. That's his NFL or NBA or whatever your thing is. That's it for him. That's where he's most comfortable. And so at the same time, when you begin to throw out that net and you're expecting, okay, we're going to catch some, but all of a sudden he throws out the net and the correct place where God has it for him, it's full beyond all measure, and he has to bring it in. Well, Peter doesn't bring it in, but the rest of them have to bring it in. It's even stretching in that moment. And we have to process, how do we do life in a way that's going to stretch us beyond everything that's comfortable? So perhaps even as a people and corporately, how do we do life corporately that's going to stretch us beyond everything and beyond all imagination, beyond all belief of what we currently understand about how we do life together corporately, about how we do church together corporately, about how we do things together corporately. And then also on the personal level, how do we do things in our family that are going to stretch us beyond everything that we see and understand, because it's meant to be. Because if we can just do everything that's about loving Jesus and being a follower of Jesus, and we can do it all from our recliner, then at what point did our lives change? At what point are we hearing the words of Jesus when he says, "Follow me"? Because nothing's following. We're all just being. It takes us acting. It takes us loving. It takes us expecting. And some of you, and I'm not picking on anybody here, but even me and our stubbornness would have looked back at whoever's yelling on the shore, and this would have, we've been out here all night long and been like, hey, I've been here all night. You want to come catch fish? You come out here. You want to throw it on the other side of the boat? You come throw it on the other side of the boat. You know what I'm saying? So even if we go back a little bit further and look at the previous verses, how many of us are even going to take the direction of the king after we've been working 80 years, 10 years, 20 years and say, you want to come catch the fish? You're welcome to come down in your sovereignty and do whatever you want. But I've been here, and I can show you the scars of how long I've been here, and this is what I've done all this time. You want to come catch the fish? Use your kingness and come do it yourself. Honestly, you laugh and you smile and you think you're just being absurd. But how much of us have this personality that think God in all of his kingdoms, if he wants to save these people, bring it. I put in my time. This is the message. This is the example that we get of, we don't get to go and we hit that clock and say, I put in X number of years of being a disciple, I put in X number of years. It's been a long, hard road. Friends, we could go through book after book after book of missionary lives who have given their life decades upon decades upon decades on the mission field, lost their wife, their children, and never seen a convert. But you know what? They were faithfully about living for the gospel during that whole time. And you hear the stories of people like Lottie Moon and others, and Annie Armstrong and so many others, and William Carey and Hudson and so many others who the moment God decided their time was done, even though they may not have seen the converts themselves, the waterfalls came. So are we willing to even stick it out in the work of making disciples, even if it takes our death before the first conversion happens? That's 3 other sermons down the road. When we come to verse 15, we look at when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to them, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to them, feed my lambs. And he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. And he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. And this he said to show him by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me. So friends, as we come to this dialogue during breakfast between Peter and Jesus, it is perhaps very fitting that this happens. For as Peter, he is the bold one. He is the one we have identified this morning as a leader, the one who sticks his foot in his mouth more than anybody else, the one who claimed to be willing to die for Jesus. He cut off Malchus's ear when Jesus was arrested, when the soldiers came, and he denied Jesus 3 separate times as Jesus prophesied that he would. Now they have a conversation about love. And this is a moment of restoration for Peter. And the question is, do you love me more than these? Notice the first one. Do you love me more than these? Just remember the conversation we just had. These. Do you love me more than the abundance of fish? Do you love me more than your vocation? When all is said and done, are you going to go back to fishing? Are you going to go back to your comfy chair because it's easier, because it's something that you know, because it's a place that you like to be? Are you going to be about the work of the kingdom? Are you going to be about loving me? Are you going to go back to some place that you know and that you understand and that you get the wheels, how they turn? He says, do you love me more than these? Notice this. It's important. It's important on how you and I do life. He says, feed my lambs. Okay, Jesus, you're at it again. Why lambs? Because they're thankless animals. They're not going to show affection. Go buy your child a lamb for Christmas. You're not going to enjoy that one very much. They're thankless animals. They're not going to show gratitude. They're going to eat. They're going to be stubborn. They're going to run off and get lost. And you're going to have to keep doing it again and again and again. Go buy a cat if you want affection. Don't go buy a cat. Jesus is commanding steadfastness, commitment with no reward. Catch the picture here. Steadfastness, commitment with no reward, no gratitude, no return affection. He says, do you love him enough to give up the reward of catching hundreds of fish, to deal with selfishness, to deal with a lack of gratitude, to deal with no return on investment? He's saying this is a no return investment type of thing here. When it comes to person-in-person interaction. And he says again, do you love me? Tend my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Notice this, friends. This is not glory. This is not recognition. This is not about winning medals. This is not about gaining for yourself position or power or fame, but this is about being a shepherd. This is about tending the sheep of the Father, the animals who need constant care. But this is the most thankless position. But also notice that this is the most privileged position, for the King of Kings is trusting his children with the care. His most trusted, his most loved, to the shepherds, those whom he is calling to be part of the mission of the kingdom of heaven, to be part of a worldwide strategy of displaying the grace of the glory of the gospel to all. Think about this for a moment. Do you love me? It's not a simple question, but it's an honest question. When we come to know Christ, we don't get to parse our lives out into segments and give God only part of whom we are, holding back our vocations, holding back our children, holding back our homes or our social calendars. The first question that Peter's asked is, do you love me more than these? Is my life given for you more important than a life for yourself, a life lived for yourself? Because even as Peter is distraught as the questions continue to come for a third time, we notice that Peter is grieved. It says in verse 17, he is grieved because it is said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed them. Because notice what he says in verse 18, truly I say to you, when you were young, you dressed yourself. You made decisions for yourself. But when you are old, you will be dressed and you will have to, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Notice this is prophesying about a time when Peter himself will be treated like Jesus was. He will be dressed, he will be beaten, and then he will be crucified. His arms are going to be stretched out. It is in this moment when we come to understand love. For even you and I, when we open our arms, when we open our lives, for Jesus says that Peter will stretch out his hands, that he will be taken where he doesn't want to go, that he will be crucified as Jesus was. Are we willing to say yes to this Jesus who's calling us to follow him? Are we willing to say and to love the sheep? Are we willing to serve the sheep? Are we willing to care for the sheep even when the sheep are thankless? And we say, well, I'm just not all about this. They don't give a lot of money back to the church. This type of ministry doesn't contribute a lot. This type of ministry takes a lot of time, and I just can't do as much as I used to. But notice what Jesus is saying here. He says, feed my sheep, take care of my sheep. It's not about the return we're getting. It's not about the gratification that we're getting. It's about how we're doing the ministry of the kingdom. And we need to grasp this morning. Jesus is trusting us with his most important, his most sacred ministry, which is loving his children, taking the gospel, displaying the glory of the gospel. Is there anything more important in the kingdom of heaven than the gospel going to God's children? It's more important than building churches. It's more important than investing money. It's more important than who we are or how well dressed we are. There's nothing more important in the world. There's nothing more important in the kingdom of heaven than the gospel being declared to the lost lambs. Nothing. And he's saying to Peter, tend my lambs, feed my lambs, care for my lambs, that's what he's saying to us in the same way, is there's nothing more important in our lives. There's nothing more. Are we willing to say to our vocation, hey, I know that this is what you want me to do at work right now, but there's something more important. And they're going to say, what's more important? It says, I am an employee of the kingdom of heaven well before I'm an employee of yours. And when God says to do something, you're going to have to wait in line because you don't even stack up. Like there's 100 things more important than before my vocation. You know what I'm saying? And it goes back to what we talked about when we were talking about in John 19, when I was giving you the illustration of when my daughter said, hey, I don't want to die that way. And at some point we have to step back and say, it's not my choice to decide how our children are going to live or die, because when God chooses to use our children for the kingdom of heaven, that's infinitely more important than what my opinion of my children is based on who I am, because God has a purpose for my children. He doesn't ask me. He doesn't care what my opinion is. You know what I'm saying? And as a dad, he doesn't care. Because the kingdom of heaven is infinitely more important than any opinion I can have about a vocation, than any opinion I can have about my children, than any opinion I can have about anybody in this room. Because the most important thing is that the lost sheep of God be found. And so when we sit here and we parse out our lives, or we parse out our money and say, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do this because this is what makes me happy, or this is what brings me joy. And we miss out on the point that what brings us the most joy in this life is not how we're spending our money, or not how we're investing our money, but how we're spending our lives for the sake of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And when we get that priority right, then we will experience an immense amount of joy that we can't even understand, that we can't even grasp, because then we will have our priorities infinitely right. And when we follow him in that way, then we get it. We get it. I've sat beside the beds of so many people who are members of this church when I got here, who are no longer with us because they're sitting beside God himself, and they would sit there and they would tell me, and I'd be like, they were experiencing so much pain, and I would walk into the house and I would sit with them and I would talk to them and I'd say, well, how are you doing today? And that was the dumbest question to ever ask somebody who's in pain. Let me just tell you, if you're doing pastoral care or going to visit somebody who's dying, you don't ask the question, how are you doing today? It's dumb, okay? Just a moment of confession. It's just the dumbest thing you can ask. You just go in and you just say, I love you. I hope I'm praying for you. You just don't ask how you're doing, because they say, I'm dying. Okay? That's how I'm doing today. Well, okay. How do you go on from that? Anyway, but I always ask the question for the first few. And I say, how are you doing today? And they would say, well, Pastor, I'm doing great. And let me tell you why I'm doing great. Because God is still good. And I'm still here. That's somebody who has their priorities right. It doesn't matter how many of their family members they've lost, or how their body is eating them from the inside out, or how they're experiencing an immense, uncontrollable amount of pain, is that they're standing at the foot of God himself, realizing that all of this is but a moment, a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of the kingdom that we're living for. So friends, do you love me? Is what Jesus is asking Peter. Do you love me? Is what Jesus is asking all of us. Do you love me more than these? Do we love God more than our vocations? Do we love God more than our idea of church? Do we love God more than our dreams? Do we love God more than our ideas of what our children should be doing, or how we want them to become physicists or doctors? Do we love God more than our imaginations? Is God all that we have? Is he all that we dream about and all that we want? Is he all that we desire for ourselves and for everybody else? Because notice this. He says, when you're old, you're going to stretch out your hands. When we're old, know this. 100% of us in this room are going to die. We know that in Peter's life story that somewhere along the line, Nero condemned Peter to death, and Peter found it unworthy that he be crucified like Jesus. So he decided he was going to be crucified upside down. That was glory, right? That's a good way to go. No. You think, yes, that's good. No, that's excruciatingly painful. But he followed Jesus, and that's what Jesus says at the end of verse 19. 2 words, follow me. And so we pick up in verse 20, and he says, and Peter turned and saw this disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved, following them. I love John. The disciple whom Jesus loved. Hey, I'm the one. The one who also leaned back against him during supper and said, Lord, who is it that's going to betray you? You notice how John is making himself out to be the hero here. And when Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. I think it's important that we got to this point this morning, because we often sit back and say, okay, I'm willing to give it all. I'm willing to follow Jesus. I'm willing to give up comforts. I'm willing to give my money. I'm willing to go to wherever. But Chad, you don't understand. I've already given so much. I don't have great health. I don't have a great bank account to start off with. I haven't been blessed like X has been. I haven't received whatever has received. Why aren't they? And you can imagine the missionaries like Hudson Taylor who goes and he loses his first wife, and then he loses a second wife, and then he loses his children along the journey, and he's sitting there thinking, okay, God, what's up? And Jesus here to Peter says, it doesn't matter what happens to this person. It doesn't matter what happens to John. It doesn't matter. Do my will, follow me. Friends, the same thing goes for all of us when we sit here and say, well, if only I could reach this amount of money in my bank account, I would do this. If only I could get to this point in my grades or this point in my degrees, if only I could finish this, or if only my children would cooperate in this and this and this. If only my children could be like this person's children. And Jesus says it doesn't matter. We don't need to compare things. We need to follow him. It's not about comparing. Because he's going to do with this person what he wants to do with this person. For the sake of the glory of the gospel. And he's going to do with us what he chooses to do with us. And he's going to put us in the exact right place at the exact right time to share the gospel with those whom he's choosing to display the gospel to. And you say, well, I don't like where I am. He didn't ask our opinion on the subject. I mean, he didn't really come down to me before I was born and say, hey, Chad, what do you think about being here? Well, you know, I kind of like this weather, and I kind of like this type of food, and I kind of like this. He didn't ask. What he did tell is, he says, follow me. Follow me. Even when you're suffering, because he tells Peter he's going to be crucified. Even when life is not going your way. And we can look at the stories of Peter and John and realize they go on different paths. And John lives to write this book. He lives to write 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. But they're used for massive purposes for the kingdom of heaven. Friends, where are we today when it comes to being children of the kingdom of heaven? Is it about our personal preferences? Is it about how we choose to do things? Because I guarantee you, if I said to you this morning, how many of us in this room believe in the name it, claim it gospel, choose it, do it your own way type of thing, none of you would raise your hands. And for the few of you who would kind of be like, maybe, I don't know, but listen to me this morning. Listen. We might say we don't believe in the name it, claim it gospel. We might say we don't believe in the prosperity gospel. But hear this, when we sit back and define God and define the gospel in our terms, we therefore are saying we believe in the name it, claim it, prosperity gospel, because therefore we are choosing to say that we have the gospel in our terms, that we choose to worship God and follow God on our terms, not on the basis of who God is and what God is doing and has done and has commanded us to do. When we say God fits into our schedule here, here, and here, and we're willing to work and serve Him here, here, and here based on who we are and not truly following Him and not truly worshiping Him, when it comes about who we are and who our identity is, not who He is and what He has done on our behalf, then it really is about a name it, claim it type of thing, because then we name God and then we name and claim what we will and can do for Him instead of saying, whatever you ask, I will follow you. Does that make sense? And I'm not trying to come down hard. I'm just saying, from a point of confession, I struggle here. I try to say, well, God, if you'll make this work, I'm willing to go here. I'm willing to go this far. I want to tell my child that you're never going to have to face an excruciating, painful death. But let us step back and realize I don't have control over that. No matter what it takes, our most important part of this life is that we step back and say, regardless of anything that we experience or have or do in this life, our most important element in this life is to be about the greatest responsibility of taking the gospel to God's lost children. Not about building greater things. Not about developing greater programs so that we can have self-gratification and have a greater sense of purpose within ourselves, but laying ourselves down sacrificially for Him. Friends, this morning, where are we on that spectrum? Do we love Him? Let us tend the lambs. Do we love Him more than these? Let us re-examine our priorities. Do we love Him? Let us renew our relationship. Let it be about the relationship more than it is about knowledge and work. Let it be about following Him. This morning, as we prepare to close, let us respond out of love, not out of duty. As we prepare to give an offering this morning, let our offering be a worship of love, not out of duty. As we prepare to respond, let it be because we recognize that we have been given the absolute greatest responsibility of any human being walking the planet today to be about the business of the kingdom of heaven. There is no greater responsibility of anybody on the planet. I mean, when you meet somebody on the street this week and they say, "What do you do for a living?" "Well, I'm a salesman." "Well, what do you sell?" "I'm a global salesman." "Well, what does that mean?" "I'm about the business of the kingdom of heaven." Is there any other greater responsibility? It doesn't matter if we're a Fortune 100 company, you work for a Fortune 100 company, or you are a stay-at-home mom, or you are a teacher, or you're a minister, or you're retired. Our first and most important job each and every day as we get up and we breathe is we're employees and we're children of the kingdom of heaven, because God has loved us and said, "Tend His sheep." Let that be our call to discipleship. Let that be our call to discipleship. Let's pray together this morning.